Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our talk. I'd like to do a quick shout out to YOW for inviting us to give this talk. And what my colleague Lisa and I want to talk to you today about is some of the lessons we've learned as we've led our teams through these very uncertain times.
Thanks, Ted, for that introduction. And thanks again, Yao, for having us. My name is Lisa. My last name is Zhu. I joined Prospa back in February 2020. It feels like a very long time ago now, thanks to COVID. I started as an engineering manager reporting into Ted as our head of engineering. Later on in October, I actually became the director of engineering. It's a long story, but stay tuned. I've been in technology for almost a decade, working with various size organizations, from very small startups to large multinationals. And Prospa is probably one of the few businesses that I've really enjoyed working in. For starters, I get to work with someone like Ted, who shares some great outdoors adventures like I do. So I'm going to pass over to him.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ted Tencza. I joined Prospa in 2018 as the head of engineering. And because it becomes a little bit relevant later on, I'll take a couple seconds to explain our fairly standard reporting structure. I reported into the CTO, and the CTO reports into the CEO. As head of engineering, I had all of the engineering managers reporting into me. So I was responsible for sort of the day-to-day running of the engineering team. And all of the individual contributors reported up into the engineering managers, such as Lisa. I've been in technology since 1997. For the last decade and a half, I've been focusing mostly on working at scale-ups and startups.
All right, so Prospa, who are we and what are we about? You probably have seen our logo over, the other direction mirrored over here and on the slide as well. We're actually founded in 2012 by two co-founders, Greg and Bo. Our vision is to change the way small business owners actually experience finance. As you can see, we are across both Australia and New Zealand. We're actually a multi-award winning fintech. I love working in technology, and I love the fact that technology is making a difference in our community. We've lent over $1.8 billion to our customers, and we contributed at an estimated $7.2 billion to the Australian GDP, as well as supporting 102,000 jobs.
So I want to try to set the scene and explain kind of, what we were doing in these uncertain times. And so in order to do that, we want to talk to you about sort of our experiences, some of the lessons that we've learned, some of the assumptions that we've made early on. I don't need to tell anyone here what the uncertain times are. I think everybody's had enough experience with COVID at this point, but we want to share our experiences with you and look through the fact that so far the only constant we've seen has been change. And so that's been a challenge in our leadership. We also want to make a small disclaimer at the start, and that is that we are not claiming that we know everything. We're not claiming we have the answers. We just think that we've had some interesting experiences we wanted to share with you and share you some of the lessons that we've learned. And hopefully you can take away some of those lessons and apply them to situations that you find yourself in these uncertain times.
Now, with that scene being set, here's actually a timeline that we're going to go through and walk through with you together. In true review session, we're going to go through chapter by chapter, just like you're going through a book review. To kick us off, we're going to talk about the calm before the storm and lockdown number 1.
So if you set the Wayback Machine for back in sort of February, March of last year, we kind of knew that COVID was coming. I don't think anybody sort of anticipated it, how hard it was going to hit us, but we knew it was coming. So we started making some preparations. And in doing those preparations, we made some assumptions. One, we assumed that we're good at remote work. After all, we're a technology organization. We've had work from home. We've had flex work. I've done talks at YOW conference itself, at YOW West, about how good we are at remote work. We made the assumption that hardware would be the hardest part of the transition. Having to make sure that we can get hardware to people. We got to make sure that people had an appropriate home office setup with good, multi-monitors and fast internet and appropriate keyboards and mouse and all of those things. And we made the assumption that we would be, back to normal fairly quickly. That in just a couple of months, COVID would be over and we'd be all back to normal. We didn't have to do a whole lot of extensive long-term planning.
So with those assumptions in mind, this is kind of the strategies that we've come up with. As an engineering manager, this is very fascinating to me because I've never walked into a situation like this. Well, let's be honest. none of us had. But what we introduced is daily check-ins. With that in mind, Ted always reminded us that work on the most important thing. And I think in a time of uncertainty, that was really helpful, just regrounding us every day as we meet together as a group. Secondly, we want to make sure everybody is taking hardware home, as Ted mentioned. Hardware is important, and we wanted to make sure that everyone has what they needed. And thirdly, we wanted to keep as much of the old routine as possible, whether it be scrum ceremonies, one-on-one, team meetings. Even though we're fully remote, we still want to make sure our team have a sense of normality in our day-to-day activities. And finally, we actually introduced online group activities like cooking and virtual happy hours to still create some kind of group connectivity within our team.
So what were some of the lessons learned and some of the reality? Well, first off, one of the big lessons we learned was all of the assumptions that we made on that first slide all turned out to be pretty incorrect. Working from home now is very different than working from home back before. You've got multiple people trying to use like one home office. You've got kids at home. You've got pets that are going crazy. Everything is on Zoom. I don't think we need to talk too much about that. I think everybody's experienced it, but it really showed that we just didn't know what we were getting into when we thought that, oh, all we need to do is just activate our business continuity plan and we'll just work from home. The other big reality that hit Prospa at this time was that we had very, very significant business challenges. As Prospa loans money to small businesses, a lot of those same small businesses were having to shut down due to COVIDs and lockdowns. So they saw their revenue significantly reduced, which meant they didn't want to take on any extra financial obligations or financial burdens, which means Prospa started seriously losing revenue. And we lost a significant amount of revenue, especially during that first wave in the May and June of 2020 timeframe. As a result, we ended up having to have some redundancies. Now, technology was hit probably the least hard in all of Prospa. We were still hit. We still had to let a couple people go. And what that did is that caused some mental health issues because people were now very, very concerned. They didn't know if they were going to have a role. Even though we said that those were the only redundancies that were planned, everybody understood that might not be the case, depending on if we can recover revenue. And because of those, something else that we learned was that it was just a classic case of premature optimization. We sat there and did a lot of our planning and a lot of prep work and everything in order to handle the hardware. We brought it home with us. We had it ready to go. And so that was something that proved to be a lot of, I don't want to say wasted effort, but it was definitely not very well targeted effort. And finally, we had a lot of difficulty maintaining relationships with other departments. And so we had to sort of find strategies and ways to kind of do that, because now that everything was virtual, everything was Zoom, you were only meeting with your team. You had no hallway conversations, you had no lunch conversations. And so we really, really struggled to make sure that the company didn't dissolve into a bunch of competing departments.
So thanks, Ted. That closes out kind of chapter 1. Now on to chapter 2, returning back to office for the very first time.
So as lockdown ended, again, this wasn't a super long lockdown, but as it ended, we realized that we were going to make a couple more assumptions. We were assuming that many people would want to work from home, as they didn't yet trust coming into the office. They didn't trust public transportation, and they might not have trusted just sort of being out in public. And so what we decided was, we made the assumption we needed leaders to lead by example. And what I mean by that is simply that we needed to have leaders who would do both working from home and working from the office, so that the employees could see that both were acceptable modes of work. Then we also thought that hybrid would be easier than full remote, because again, we had people who would be working where they were most comfortable working. And we assumed that hybrid would be ongoing. And I think the fact that we're in a Zoom call right now shows that that's not the case.
Once again, with the assumptions that we've made, these are the strategies that we went in for return to office. Firstly, we wanted to make sure that our team members actually had an autonomy of location. We're fully aware that for some team members, it's more sensible for them to work from home, while for others, they can't wait to come back to the office because home was just so noisy and distracting. But at the same time, we wanted to make sure that we balance the need for contact, that in-personal connection, also with the reality of a pandemic happening at the same time. And secondly, we actually supported and leaned into our PNC sponsored wellbeing activities. Our company was very intentional. One of our values is one team, about looking after our people and looking after one another. Now, as engineers, you can imagine, this is kind of yet another thing that we must do. And Shai, our CTO, and Ted, as our head of engineering at the time, was adamant about us as leaders leaning in and actually leading by example, making sure that we don't lead with any kind of cynicism. We're actually bringing our team on the journey and encouraging them to participate and making sure that they understand this is something that is very beneficial to them. We did something like a step challenge where Ted was the reigning champion. He was really hard to beat. I would say if I ever need to get fit again, I'm going to get in a physical competition with Ted, and it's going to keep me going. And we also had CTO and CEO AMAs, which stands for Ask Me Anything. In a time of uncertainty, it was really important for our team members to get a sense of where are we going? How are we doing? Is there anything that we could do? What are the things that we haven't considered? And giving them that direct line of sight to our key leaders was crucial and vital, and it helped a lot in our team's engagement. And lastly, we took what opportunity we had, regulations permitting, to ensure our team actually had the opportunity to actually meet with one another within social distancing and do some activities together. So we conduct some picnics and games outside, and that was another fantastic adventure.
So one of the things that, the reality set in when we decided to go hybrid, we had a couple of rules that we put in place to try to make sure that the hybrid worked, and the people that were not in the office were just as productive as the people that were in the office. And one of those things that we did was that, if one person's on Zoom, everybody needs to be on Zoom so that everybody's got their laptop in front of them. Even if it's a Zoom room and everybody's on mute, we still want to make sure that you're on Zoom. That quickly led to Zoom fatigue. And so while that's just one example, it shows that you have to be able to, look at other possible ways of doing it and understand what are the consequences of sort of the realities that you're putting in place to try to help people. From that, I think what we really learned, it's important to be both positive and truthful as you go through these different activities and as you give out news to the organization. As Lisa mentioned, we had AMAs where the CTO and the CEO answered really tough questions about, are there more redundancies coming? What's our revenue situation like? And in being truthful, it really helped calm down a lot of people's nerves, because they felt like, if something is going wrong, we'll know about it, and we'll know about it early. But also to Lisa's point, it's very, very important to be positive in the communications. Engineers, as a rule, can be quite cynical. And if you're cynical, you give them the excuse to be even more cynical, and that just cascades down. And then all of the truth in the world doesn't help, because people are just too cynical to actually buy it, and they just won't follow along, and they won't follow you. And finally, and this one was something that is interesting to me, is that I've always advocated for a hybrid working environment with distributed teams. I've even given a talk like I said, at YOW West, talking about how hybrid is better because it allows people to work where they want to work, which is still really important. But once we went into that full remote mode, I sort of now get why people who advocate for fully remote do so. There were a lot of things that actually helped us in full remote that we couldn't do in hybrid. I'm still a big fan of hybrid. I still think it's important because we want to have the ability to catch up with people. Going into the office was interesting, as days in the office were usually the least productive days because everybody was spending time talking to people they hadn't talked to in 6 months. Sorry.
All right, so that closes out chapter 2 for us. Now on to chapter 3. This is the most exciting part. Remember how I said that I became the director of engineering? Stay tuned. We're about to find out why.
So I need to share some personal information here. As we went into this return to office and doing work, I was having issues with family members who are really suffering during COVID. I have 2 daughters that have severe anxiety, have clinical depression, and those 2 conditions are really, really exacerbated by COVID. It really makes people anxious and it really makes people depressed. So when you already have that as issues, it made it very, very difficult. We also had a real fear of public transport because the virus was still seemed to be going very, very strong in the community, and there was a lot of community transmissions, and we really didn't want the kids on public transport. And their school happens to be 45 minutes away in one direction because it's a school that actually helps them and cares more about sort of learning and has coping strategies for their anxiety and their depression. Plus, we had other issues with physical health issues, appointments with therapists, appointments with doctors, and everything like that, along with the 3 hours every day of schoolwork. And it just was turning into being too much. It just was really falling into the too hard basket. And so I needed time to handle and to help manage the family and what was going on. So at that point, I gave Shai, our CTO, a call. And it was that call that all the leaders fear. I called him up on a Monday morning and said, "Hi, I need to talk to you, just 15 minutes. It's kind of urgent. Can you make time to talk right now?" And so he gets on the call, and you can see in his eyes, he's like, "Oh, great, here's the resignation call." So literally the first words out of my mouth were, "I'm not resigning." At which point you can see his whole stress level just decrease by quite a bit. It didn't last very long because then I told him the rest of the story about how I absolutely needed to take a significant amount of time off in order to help with my family, which was going to cause, in many ways, causes even more issues than just resigning. Because now we have to figure out, okay, what's the transition plan? And we'll talk about transition back plan later. But what was really nice was the fact that Shai actually supported me in this journey, and we came up with a way in order to have myself transition out in order to take 6-month leave of absence to focus on family. And it was really, really important that everyone understood that this was my choice. So we'll go through now some of the leadership transition assumptions and strategies. So the first assumption, and this was again back in sort of September of last year, late August, early September of last year, that it was going to be temporary, right? I was absolutely not resigning. I was just taking some time off. 2, that we assumed that the org would continue to grow, because even though I talked earlier about how we had redundancies, by this point we could start to see some recovery in our revenue. The business was starting to improve, and we were looking like we were going to start hiring soon. So we assumed that the organization would continue to grow while I was out. And thirdly, we assumed that everyone would have a shared understanding of who should step in order to take on this role. And one of the reasons we had that, or one of the reasons that I assumed we had a shared understanding, was that that person was going to be Lisa. And even though she hadn't even been at the company for a year yet, she had already been nominated for Leader of the Year. She had taken over one team that had had a lot of process problems and a lot of delivery problems, as well as some retention problems, and turned that team around in a very, very short amount of time. And it was such a good job that when we had another team that was struggling a little bit with leadership, we had that team report into Lisa also, because we knew that she could handle both of those. So turn over to Lisa to talk a little bit about how she felt about this.
Thanks, Ted. It's always good to hear how well you're doing from another leader's eyes. So I guess for me, this was a bit of a surprise, because the first thing that I learned when I heard that Ted is going to take on a sabbatical, I was like, is he coming back? Like, is everything okay? And thankfully, Shai was like, yep, everything is fine. Ted just has some personal stuff that he needs to take care of. And I was like, okay, so what is the ask? What do you want from me? It was a funny lunch with Shai where he's kind of a bit cryptic, going, I have something very exciting I want to share with you. And I heard him out. And to me, the first reaction was, okay, this is huge. I have never done something like this before. I don't know if I will be able to do something like this. But one of my friends' words kind of echo in my brain, where it's opportunities like this don't happen very often. And when it comes along, make sure you grab it. So without having to think about it overnight or anything like that, in that moment and at that meeting, I was like, all right, I'm gonna have a go. But just so you know, here's my disclaimer. I'm gonna make lots of mistakes. I'm gonna learn from the job. Are you okay with that? And Shai was very supportive and he was truthful and he's like, yep, I'm gonna be with you every step of the way. And that's kind of how we started.
So here was some of our strategies. First off is we had to have a clear communications plan. And that communications plan, at the heart of it, was an understanding that this was my decision to take the time off. And that was important because literally the message was taking time to spend more time with his family, which, as everybody knows, is a euphemism for, okay, they're doing really poorly, and so we're going to be letting them go. But that, in this case, fortunately wasn't the case. I actually was taking time off to spend more time to take care of my family. We decided to do the handover really early. So get Lisa involved in what I do as early as possible so she had enough time to shadow me in the various meetings and to be able to understand what it is I did. We also wanted to make sure that we were very, very clear about who was in charge, right? This wasn't going to be a case of, she's stepping in as acting head of engineering, but you're allowed to sort of ignore her because you can find me somewhere or go around to our boss, to Shai, and we wanted to make sure that everyone understood that even though it was acting head of engineering, it was still head of engineering, and that it was important that I demonstrated also that I believed in that. And finally, mentoring. It wasn't a long period of time between the time that I decided I was going to take a sabbatical and when I left, it was about 6 weeks. But during that time, doing as much mentoring as I could to Lisa, and discussing things like leadership and making sure that she understood that, lead as Lisa. Don't try to lead as you think Ted would lead, because that would just lead to, very poor leadership. So, and how did you feel about sort of these, Lisa?
Thanks, Ted. Look, I wasn't sure what to expect, and I just took on any opportunities and any guidance that Ted has given me. I attended every meeting that he's invited me to, even the meetings that he did not invite me to, and I heard about it. I was like, Ted, should I come to this meeting? Should I listen in? And I was taking notes. Anyone who knows me knows I'm a frantic note taker. Not frantic, I just take a lot of notes. It helped a lot, actually. That definitely paid off. And also asking Ted lots of questions about what does this role involve? What does success look like? Because at the end of the day, when you go into a new role like this, where there's only a 6-week window, you got to maximize the time that you have in terms of understanding what is expected of you and what is required of you. And at the same time, I also needed to broaden my view of the business very quickly, because I joined the team taking on one team at the beginning and then a secondary team. But even then, in my mind, I had more time to get to know the business. But stepping into Ted's shoes, all of a sudden I realized there's so much more of the business that I do not know and do not understand. And I need to learn how to do that. And another piece of advice that Ted gave me that I found very reassuring is that I don't need to know everything. I just need to know who to go to find the information I need. And I have a team of great team leads I can lean on and get their expertise. And that was yet another great piece of advice from Ted.
So what are some of the lessons we learned and what was some of the reality? First off is the communications probably could have been slightly better. Not around necessarily, the fact that I was going on sabbatical, but around sort of the process by which we made decisions about how we were going to structure it while I was on sabbatical. So while this is kind of, my situation is unique, I don't think too many people at the conference are planning on 6-month-long sabbaticals with somebody taking over as head of engineering. I do think that some of the lessons that we learned here are still applicable. One of the things that we explained to the engineering managers was, that Lisa would be taking over. And I probably needed to a much better job explaining the thought process behind why. Again, leaning back to the earlier assumptions, I assumed that everybody would automatically assume it was Lisa. And so I needed to be more mindful of the other people on my team and letting them know what my thought process and what the decision process was from both myself and Shai. Second thing is being very, very clear actions. Early on, I was a little bit wishy-washy in sort of what I was going to do. When I was talking to Shai, I was saying, maybe 3 months from now I'll take off 6 months. And then when I was talking to other people on the team, I was like, well, maybe in 6 weeks I'll take off 3 months. And part of that was just fear, like a fear of the unknown. I've never taken a sabbatical before. I didn't know how long I could be away before my skills started to atrophy. I didn't know how long I'd be away before I became irrelevant. And so I was nervous. Shai called me out on it and said, listen, you can't do that. Your uncertainty is cascading to everybody else. As a leader, you have to have clear communications on this. So take a stand, say what you're going to do. We'll support you in it, but we need to know, and we need to let everybody else know. We also needed to continue to understand kind of what the expectations were for Lisa, that she was taking over, that she was going to be in charge, and that she was going to be growing into the role, as she mentioned. But just wanted to say that those are the kind of lessons learned. You be very, very clear on the expectations, be very clear on the communications, and be mindful of people who are going to be even indirectly impacted by this role, but definitely be more mindful of the people that are directly impacted.
Thanks, Ted. And from my perspective, this was a just parachute into the situation and learn really quickly situation, right? I've taken as much notes as I could. I've got as much out of Ted as I possibly could before he goes away after 6 weeks. But what I really need to learn is trust my gut and go and have meetings with my counterparts, whether it's the director of product, listening to my team leads in terms of what are the challenges they are facing and what support do they need from me, and going to Shai and sense checking about, I've encountered this issue, who is the best person to talk to? Is my assessment about this correct? And I can see, looking back now, I've actually grown in confidence, and I trusted my gut a lot more because I actually had such a safe environment to bounce my ideas off and to test them out and to actually just get some feedback on what I think I was going to do before I actioned them. Now, you might have a very different leadership style where you dive head in and you run with it and then you look back later. I'm a lot more cautious, and this works for me. But the point that I'm trying to make here is when you're stepping into a new role, you kind of need to give yourself time and grace to find your feet. And it's okay if you don't know everything at the get-go. But the important thing is you believe in yourself and you find the support that you need so that you can keep moving forward. And the other thing that I really appreciate was before Ted left, he offered to have a one-on-one with me once a month, which I was like, yes, please. I definitely want to have someone I can talk to. And it was more valuable than I can ever imagine. Just having a peer who is not my boss that I'm reporting into, it's not my team that I'm leading, it's not a counterpart that I need to work day to day with, but just somebody who understands the challenges I'm facing and be able to bounce ideas, or just having a safe space to rant or vent, so to speak, really helped me to actually think through my thinking process. And oftentimes I think I look back now, many of those sessions, I was just sitting there talking to Ted and watching his facial expression and then going, oh, okay, yep, I'm on the right track, or oh, maybe don't do that again. But it's actually really wonderful. And that's my hope and encourage for everybody who's on this call. As leaders, it's really important that you actually have somebody that you can go to, a safe place that you can bounce ideas with. If you have more than one, fantastic. If you don't have one, it's never too late to find one. All right, so we're about to move into the leadership transition number 2, because Ted was going away for 6 months and he needs to come back.
So as decided how I was going to re-enter Prospa, there was a number of challenges. And again, we had a number of assumptions that sort of changed from between when I transitioned out to when I was going to transition back in. So these assumptions were a lot more realistic than the original ones. First off, we would not transition back to the pre-transition one state. That just wasn't realistic. We were making the assumption that Lisa would continue in her role. I had still some challenges with my family. So I asked and received permission to come back part-time. And there was no way that I could run an engineering head of engineering role on 3 days a week. It just wasn't going to work. And finally, the team, we had originally thought it would grow enough to where we could, sort of split the team in half, and each of us have enough people to justify being the head of engineering. but the team just hadn't grown quickly enough. We faced a lot of challenges around that, and so we just weren't able to execute that particular strategy that we had thought we might do when I was first leaving. So that was sort of the assumptions that we made and some of the challenges that I still faced trying to come back into the organization. So do you want to anything to add to that, Lisa?
I guess for me, it's not so much about assumptions. I had some expectations as someone who's currently leading the role and knowing that Ted is going to come back. For me, it's really important that we do the transition really well, because in a time of uncertainty, we really want our team to have clarity about what do they do, who are they responsible to, and who are they accountable to. That was really important. Secondly, I didn't know exactly how it's going to pan out, because as Ted described, 6 months ago, we made these plans, but the real world doesn't look the way it is 6 months later. But I did have this deep trust and deep faith in Shai and Ted at this point, because I've worked with them for long enough that I understand their character, and I know that whatever the outcome is going to be, it's going to be a positive one for everybody involved and for Prospa. And the other thing for me that was really important is to make sure that Ted and I have a shared understanding of how do we actually work going forward together. So with those things in mind, let's have a look at what strategies we have taken.
So one of the most important things we did was Shai and I sat down and we came up with a deliberate plan for what the reentry would look like. So we started planning this about 3 months before I came back. So it evolved over time as the assumptions kind of evolved over time. But we didn't just say, okay, show back up on the last, the date of your return, just come back in and we'll figure it out then. We actually met for a half-day workshop to plan out exactly what my work would look like. We had to figure out what the communications plan was, because when I left, the comms had gone out that, I would be gone for 6 months and then I would come back and slot back into the head of engineering role. And that just wasn't going to work. And so what I really needed also was meaningful work. So even though I'm not coming back into the head of engineering role, I don't want to come back and do just busy work. I don't want to come back and just sort of, sit on the sidelines and do just random things. I really wanted to do meaningful work and be able to contribute to the success of Prospa, as well as giving myself job satisfaction. And finally, I had to make sure that Shai and Lisa understood that my situation at home wasn't solved, right? My family was being managed. The problems were being managed. The problems weren't solved. The problems still aren't solved. They're managed. And so that meant that I needed to make sure that I didn't go and get back into a full-time head of engineering, always on kind of work, because I needed to still be, at home for at least part of the work week.
That's awesome. And from my perspective, I really wanted to make sure that I hear Ted's perspectives and his concerns, and that we're actually working together. Like, I wanted him to take the lead in this communication, in this conversation, because I know it's a big shift for him. And from my perspective, because I said that I actually have this trust with Shai and Ted, I know that they will make the best decision for everybody involved. I was willing to just let it go and see what happens. And it turns out that my trust in my leaders were well justified, and they were actually incredible to work with. And for me, it's really making sure that I understand the messaging so that I can be clear and succinct about it with my team, and that I understand how to communicate with the stakeholders as well, and setting the platform and the stage for Ted to return.
So a couple of things that we hit with reality and some of the lessons learned. First off is, change is unpredictable. When we made this change back in September, October of last year, really did think at the time that it was going to be 6 months off and then I would come back and slot back in. And it was pretty early on that we realized that just wasn't going to be feasible. And we had to be able to communicate that. The other thing is that change cascades. And by this, what I mean is, if I came back and slotted back into the head of engineering role with Lisa slotting back into the engineering manager's role, that would not only have impacted Lisa, it would have also impacted other of the engineering managers who had stepped up to fill in for some of the things that Lisa was now no longer doing. So everybody's kind of career choice or career progress would have been hampered if we just went back to the way things were. So that just wasn't really an option. And so we needed to make sure that as Lisa said, that the org structure was very, very clear, that people understood that, as I'm coming back in a slightly different role. I'm not coming back as the head of engineering. And making sure that people understood that, so they didn't start to try to work around Lisa and saying, okay, Ted's back, I'm just going to go to him and try to get this problem solved, after Lisa already told them, no, you're not doing that, or whatever the case may be. And I think it's really important that I call out for Shai, that he created an environment where we could make this work, where we could make it to where I could add value and have meaningful work, even with just a few reports. So what we did was we set aside several new sort of projects that I would own and run with, that were very, very meaningful for Prospa, needed to be done, that Lisa was kind of doing as part of the head engineering role, but was usually doing it, sometimes late at night, sometimes on the weekends, because there was just a little bit too much there. And so I was able to take on these very, very big projects that had a lot of value, even though they didn't have a lot of people. So one of them was creating a support engineering department, basically from scratch. So we had never had any, we'd had sort of developers doing support on occasion, but we never had actual support engineering. And so as we grow, that was proving to be a real struggle point. The operations team was constantly trying to get support into the point where, they would come and try to find their favorite developer to try to get something in behind the scenes, which of course is never good. And it's never the way that you want to have workflow through an organization. And another area was working on Prospa's recruiting, hiring, onboarding, and overall branding, and basically reaching out and working with the community and on Prospa. And that is, I've done a lot of meetups, I've done a lot of conference talking, and it is one of my favorite things to do. So it gave me a lot of job satisfaction for being able to do this. And I've often said it in the past, that it doesn't matter, your worth and your effectiveness as an engineering manager or head of engineering is not dependent upon how many people you have in the organization reporting to you. But I'd never lived that. I'd always lived where every time I got more responsibility, I got more people. And so it was really nice to sort of see an organization that was willing to support me and willing to allow me to have such meaningful work without having to be the head of engineering. And finally, it's, as Lisa mentioned, having someone that as a peer that understands sort of exactly what you're going through, someone that you can maybe be a little cynical with because you don't have to worry about it cascading down, somebody you can be very, very open and honest with because it's not a boss. And it had been approximately 6 years since I've had a peer, because as head of engineering, yes, there were people in sort of other parts of the organization, but nobody that was sort of facing the exact same problems that I was facing. Excuse me. And prior to that, I was a CTO at my former company. So again, I didn't have any direct peers in technology organizations. So having Lisa as somebody I can bounce ideas off of, we meet quite often, and it's usually the highlight of my day.
Thanks, Ted. Did you have something else to add?
No, go ahead.
Okay, awesome. I know that I like our one-on-ones as well, really early in the mornings and on Wednesdays and Thursdays, definitely the highlight my day. It's good to get started in that way. A few things I want to add here from my perspective as well. This is an interesting transition. I've never worked with someone who was my boss and then became my peer and came back into the organization. So to say the least, it was a bit awkward to get started with. I wasn't sure, how to act and how to speak, because I really want to make sure that Ted has his place and his space next to me and alongside me, and how do we facilitate that? And one thing that's really cool about Ted is he's someone that is very authentic and genuine. How he comes across is how he acts. And one of our company values is be bold, open, and real. And I think he's somebody that exemplifies that. And we were able to have some really open conversations about how things are going, what do we need from each other, what supports do we need. And I know this is something that I personally have learned as part of this transition process, is asking for help and just being vulnerable about where I'm at. And I was able to do that with Ted. And I would say this is probably one of the few people that I've collaborated with that we actually got on the same page extremely quickly. And it just looked like we planned this all along, but we didn't. We just worked it out as it went. And I felt very supported by Ted, by the way that he's very intentional about inviting my inputs and passing things back into my bucket. And I did the same for him. And it just made my life easy. So thank you, Ted.
Yes. So one of the things we wanted to make sure was that everyone understood that the org structure was clear. And so, for instance, as I was working on improving the hiring process, I had to make sure that all the decisions were approved by Lisa, because in the end, the people are being hired into her organization, not mine. So that was just sort of one, for instance, that wanted to make sure I wasn't in any way giving the impression that it wasn't Lisa who was still in charge.
All right, so this brings us to our last chapter, lockdown number 2. I'm in Sydney, I'm definitely experiencing it. A little bit Perth, maybe you're not the same, but let's see what we've learned here.
So for one, this is ongoing. We're still in a very, very strict lockdown here in Sydney, which is unfortunate because I would love to have been in Perth to give this talk live. When we sort of started this lockdown, first of all, we thought it was going to be short. We assumed that it would be 2 weeks because that's what the government said. It would be 2-week lockdown, we'd be out of it. And we also thought, hey, we know how to deal with office closures. This is lockdown 2. We've done this before. We know how to do this. We've solved our sort of remote onboarding challenges and our how to work thing. But that turns out, again, those assumptions are not 100% accurate. So turn it over to Lisa to talk about some of the strategies that we've used to try to manage going forward.
Yes, so this is an ongoing saga. It's one of my favorite words of the season, the story that never ends. Hopefully it ends soon. So a couple of strategies that we've actually put in is to make sure that our team are getting deliberate mental health checks-ins. So one of the things that Shai has actually asked us to do is to check in with our team on a regular basis and just get them to give us a score out of 1 to 10 on how they're feeling. They don't need to necessarily justify it, but it gives us a baseline and also get our people to really think about where they're at and get them a time to reflect. Often conversations do flow from that, which is fantastic. And the other piece that we're doing as well is we engage with LiveStreet, one of our vendors. It's probably one of the best support vendors that I've worked with in my career so far. It's short, only 10 years, but they were very interesting. They do not sponsor us, so I just want to give them a call out. And then the other part that we're doing as well is something that Shai and Ted is very passionate about is skip level one-on-ones, because we want to make sure every engineer actually have access to 2 levels of management. And as part of these, I'm very intentional about seeking how our team are going, hearing them, and also giving them a sense of reassurance and giving them the vision from a senior leadership perspective of where our team is going, how are we doing, and what can we do to support our team members. And in this season, these are the small things that actually adds up and makes a big difference for our team.
We do still have some big challenges that we're working through, trying to get people to remote onboarding. We've got sort of hardware shortages, making those meaningful connections with new hires, being able to actually even hire people. The market's a little crazy right now, especially in Sydney, and trying to make sure that we retain as many people as possible. So these things are still hard. We don't have all the answers yet. These are the things that we're working on. So we'll keep you updated as we learn our lessons here, hopefully when we come out of lockdown. So we want to give you just a couple of final takeaways, hopefully that you can help in your own organizations. First off, it's not a big surprise, but beware of the premature optimizations. Like I said, we spent a lot of time planning for stuff that really didn't matter, and we probably could have, done a lot less of that and a lot more things that would have been a little bit more helpful, especially at the beginning.
And secondly, be bold, open, and real. Vulnerability is a real gift, and if you are a follower of Brene Brown or you enjoy her books, she gave some really great talks on YouTube. I encourage you to follow up and actually listen to that.
And along with that, being bold and open, it's okay to ask for help. Hopefully in your organization, it's okay to ask for help, because without being able to be honest about that, my situation would have been very, very dire.
And next, make sure that you have clear and consistent communications of expectations. As we've referenced, Ted and I both referenced in our talk so far, in times of uncertainty, clarity is key. And sometimes our team members just want to hear from 3 different leaders what their thoughts are on the same topic. And if they get the same answer or similar answers, it actually gives them a huge sense of reassurance and clarity that they're on the right track and what they're hearing is where we're going.
Set and enforce boundaries. As people are working really hard, they're working super long hours. You need to sort of pay attention to their mental health, and one of those is to set and enforce boundaries so people aren't working at 10 o'clock at night, 6 o'clock in the morning.
And adding to that, we really want to make sure that our leaders have understanding and empathy. We're all human. It's not just our team members is going through a hard time. Our leaders are also going through a hard time. And what we lead and how we lead in this season, the examples we set, what we say and do not say, actually speaks volumes for our team. And ultimately, I believe it makes our team more resilient and stronger going forward.
And finally, iterate. The assumptions that you're going to make, a lot of them are going to be right, but a lot of them are going to be wrong. So iterate, try new things, try new strategies, help your team.
And finally, this is not the end, right? I mean, the talk is coming to an end, but you can keep the conversation going with both myself and Ted. We're both on LinkedIn, and Ted is also on Twitter on a very cool Twitter handle.
So we'd like to thank you for listening to our talk, and hopefully we've given you some things to take away, and hopefully you've got some value at it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ted and Lisa. Two things that I would like to point out, I guess, is first of all, there is another Lisa Zhu on Twitter. It's not this one, so don't try and tweet at her. She'll be wildly confused. Ask me how I know. And the other thing of interest is we still have you listed as head of engineering on our site, so we need to sort that out. It's all wildly confusing. All right, now to the actual real questions now. First from Patrick. Was the decision to give Lisa that role accepted by the whole team? And if not, how was that expectation managed?
So as I sort of mentioned at the beginning, it wasn't so much that it wasn't accepted as much as it was there was questions on how the decision was made and why some of the managers weren't considered for the role. And in fact, they were considered. They just weren't consulted. And so without making that clear, it did put Lisa into a bit of an awkward spot. So that's why I mentioned that I would be much more deliberate about explaining what the process was so they know that they were considered. It's just Lisa was the correct person for the job.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective as well, one thing I found really helpful is having leaders that actually back the leadership decisions, right? So I know that if someone goes to Shai or goes to Ted and asking them questions, they will actually be able to articulate and explain what was going on and how it was happening. Now, I may not be in those conversations directly myself. I know from how people interacted, reacted after different situations, I know that there was a conversation that has happened and what is the outcome of that conversation. So having leaders that actually support other leaders stepping into these roles are vitally important in that kind of the success of these kind of transitions.
Okay, question for Lisa. Was it a weirder / harder relationship with the rest of the team when Ted first left or when he first came back?
I will say when he first left, because it was strange transitioning from being peers into now suddenly I'm your boss and you're reporting into me. So that was definitely a weird thing. When Ted came back, I think we kind of have a sense of normality, and also we were very intentional about communicating these things up front. So our leaders actually had time to process and think through what are things actually going to look like for them and get their questions answered.
Next question is from Anonymous. In my experience, people in leadership roles tend to get run down or burnt out over time, causing negativity to creep into positive environments. How do you limit this and keep a positive direction?
I think there's a couple of different strategies for this. First off is if you are starting to feel run down or burnt out, ask for help. If you're in an organization that's supportive, you can get the help. Now, that doesn't mean you have to take 6 months off to avoid the burnout, but you can maybe take a couple of days off. We have mental health days, we have me days, things like that. You can look at offloading some of your responsibilities onto other team members, perchance. You can just have somebody give you a pep talk. If you've got a boss and you're saying, I'm kind of burning out, just try to help lift them up, try to support them. And finally, you can really look at what is your actual workload, right? Are you spending so much time working on things that are urgent but not important, that you're wasting sort of your cycles? You've only got so many cycles. There's only so much work you can do in the day, which is why when we first went into lockdown, Lisa had mentioned earlier, we sat there every single day and asked people, are you working on the absolute most important thing you can be working on? Because with everybody sort of remote, with everybody, in a super uncertain time, we wanted to make sure that, hey, work on the most important thing. And if you're doing that, it can help control the amount of workload, and it can also help with avoiding getting burnt out and run down. But for me, the biggest strategy here is asking for help. Just ask for help.
Adding to Ted as well, like I think one thing is really important. You are the best version of yourself that you can offer to others, right? So you got to take care of yourself first and foremost. That's why I talk about, live stream and the mental health check-ins, and actually having an ally that you can bounce ideas with. Ideally more than one, because at the end of the day, we're not islands. We have feelings, we have emotions. Work can be frustrating. Leadership is hard, and it's often the hardest job in the room sometimes, that it's quite thankless. Very few people will tell you, hey, you're doing a good job. So it's actually really important to have those allies in your life, and also taking time for yourself and actually understand what recharges you. What are the things that gives you the most excitement and purpose in your life, and find those things, making sure you make time to do them as well, not just all about work and what outcomes you're going to accomplish and achieve.
Great. The next question's from David. It's for you, Lisa. What was the single hardest thing about stepping into Ted's role, and how did you deal with that?
I wouldn't know this is the hardest thing. I think the most challenging thing that came up a lot when I first stepped into Ted's shoes was people were asking, when is Ted coming back, and what's happening? So it's actually repeating that story back to people. That's one of the reasons why I say, in times of uncertainty and times of change, oftentimes people go to different leaders and asking the same questions, and they kind of want to know, do you have a plan? Like, is the messaging still consistent? That was the one thing that I find most fascinating. But also at the same time, for me, it's being very intentional about setting the scene, because my understanding when I stepped into the role is that Ted is going to come back. So in the decision that I'm making and the activities I'm framing is actually laying the groundwork for Ted to come back and actually go, this is what we're doing now, but on Ted's return, some of these things may shift and change, but this is the process that we have today. So, and as time goes on, people actually build that trust. They understand what my intentions were, how I'm approaching this. Those questions actually stop, and I can see that we actually focus on very productively in terms of how to actually move forward into that next season.
I'm having flashes of the journos at the presses asking the same question to the Premier and the health officer and the other guy and the other one.
That's it.
Okay, our last question here is from Anonymous. What methods did you use to enforce boundaries to help stop colleagues from working overtime remotely?
There's a couple of strategies we have. First off, let me put in a quick caveat, and that is, enforce is something we want to say to try to make sure people are taking it seriously, but it's not like we could enforce it. We're not going over to people's houses and stealing their computers from them from 10 p.m. at night till 6 o'clock in the morning, kind of thing. But couple strategies. First off is, lead by example. Be very intentional when you leave. So when I log off, sort of at 5 p.m., I make sure that I announce to the team, hey, I'm logging off. I'll see everybody tomorrow, so that they have permission to sort of leave. They know that I'm not working till 10 o'clock at night. Excuse me. And quite frankly, on days where I do have to work till 10 o'clock at night, I log off at 5 and then sneak back in so they don't see it, so that they can still think that, hey, I've got the permission to sort of, turn off. Be deliberate about what those boundaries are. It's hard to enforce the boundaries if you haven't told people what they are. Explain what the expectations are, that you don't need to answer an email on the weekend. And if I send you an email on the weekend, feel free to ignore it. I'm sending it because I don't want to forget that I need to do this. It's not that I expect you to have a response. I just don't want to forget this and everything. So making sure that people understand that, being very clear about sort of what the expectations are, what the boundaries are, I think is important, because if they don't know what those boundaries are, it's really hard for them to feel like they're staying within the boundaries.
My only thing to add to this is communicating proactively and actually letting people know that you notice that they put in the extra effort and checking in with team members. So if I see someone sending me an email at 11 p.m., the next day when I catch up with them, I will just gently check in and say, hey, Michelle, I noticed you sent me an email at 11. Is everything okay? Like, how's the workload? Is there anything I can do to support you? And making sure that our team understand this is our expectation of them. We actually don't want them to be working all the time, and we're actually checking in and being intentional as a leader. paying attention to those little things is actually what counts. As I mentioned before, the small things is actually what adds up to the big things.
One other thing that I forgot, and that is, what you reward and what you acknowledge as good work will have an impact on what people do. So if you sit there and say, okay, we've got these boundaries, you don't have to work late, and then you give, hey, we're giving, a big public announcement, so-and-so worked, 87 hours last week, so here's a special bonus, coffee for you or whatever, then you've just undermined all of the boundaries that you set. So don't reward that the people just working the long hours. Like, reward what the outputs are or what the outcomes are. So reward the fact that, hey, this project got launched on time. Hey, this this new feature is really popular amongst our customers. But don't celebrate, oh, and the team worked 80 hours a week for 6 months in order to get it across the line.